Derek Wheatley, and welcome to episode 99 of the Wheatley podcast. Thank you very much for coming on YouTube if you're watching it, or listening on the podcast platforms. We really appreciate your support. Thank you very much, Neve Fitzpatrick, for coming on last week to talk about her life as a psychologist. She was really open about the passing of her sister and how to deal with grief in the kind of public limelight the way she had to with regards to her sister Dara. It was an excellent interview. I loved having her on, so thank you very much, Neve. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you would. That'd be excellent. Just if you haven't done it yet, just click on it. Oh, it's down the bottom. You don't have to watch every episode. It's just, to help us, support us a little bit would be really nice. But we'll get into today's episode. Our guest today is a film and culture writer for publications such as Little White Lies and Sight and Sound magazine. Lillian Crawford. How are you doing, Lillian?
I'm very good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you very much. I had my hood up and my hands in my pockets right up until you came on the screen because my room is freezing. I decided to shave my head yesterday. That was not a good idea, I will say that. We always start at the beginning because it seems like the appropriate place to begin as always. So could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please, Lillian?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in Kent in a fairly small village quite near to Maidstone, and it's quite peaceful there. It was a good place sort of during COVID because I went back home, as many people did, to go for sort of walks, and it's quite a peaceful place, but actually it's also very parochial. It's very it's not particularly diverse, and it's quite Christian, and my upbringing was very religious. I used to go to Sunday school and to church regularly with my family, and but my parents and my extended family have always been very much sort of on the liberal side of Christianity. They've always been very sort of open and accepting in ways that perhaps some people within that community might not be. So my childhood was lovely, really. And then when I got to secondary school, things got a bit worse. I struggled a lot at secondary school. I was bullied a lot, which had quite a negative impact on my self-confidence and my self-image, and that led that there was a build-up of trauma there that I don't think I identified at the time, and it wasn't until I was at university that was something that came out of some of the counselling sessions that I had, and I was told that I have complex PTSD. Okay. As a result of that. So yeah, that was something that I sort of dealt with when I was at university, and that's something that I started writing about not that long ago. Only really about 2 years ago I started writing about trauma and films and looking at how that's represented, because I didn't realize until I was told I had PTSD that you could have PTSD as a result of I thought it was something that only people who had been in war zones had. That was sort of how I'd understood PTSD, but actually people who have been sexually assaulted like myself and abused in various ways, that also can cause PTSD. So yeah, that was sort of how I got to where I am now. Yeah.
I mean, obviously the second question is always about, mental health, and obviously you've touched on that already, but can I ask with regards to when you did, because I've spoken a lot about therapy on here and a lot of people have come on and talked about it. Did your experience in therapy give you the confidence to start writing about mental health and not even mental health, but your experiences and film as well?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because counselling has always been a part of my life, and when I was growing up, my parents thought I had autism when I was a child, and actually, as it turns out later on, that I do in fact have autism. But I think that there was the sort of depressive and post-traumatic stress side of things was sort of conflicting with diagnoses, and it was making it difficult to sort of find the right people to talk to effectively. I didn't realize that I had PTSD until I went on University Challenge when I was at university, and I was triggered by something, and I'm not really sure what it was. I think it was something to do with the lighting. A light sort of went over my eyes, and I just completely disassociated while I was on camera. So it's quite strange seeing a contrast, because I was on 6 episodes of University Challenge. The first 3 I was fine and I was doing quite well, and the last 3 we filmed over one weekend, and when I watched it back, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not there. I was just completely in a different place. And my partner at the time said that it was probably some sort of post-traumatic stress, and encouraged me to seek help with that. So I think because I'd had so much counselling when I was younger, and I found it very frustrating because it was very confused and no one really knew what we were sort of dealing with. It was mostly to talk about how I was being bullied, but I wasn't really opening up about what that was really like to people. And I then finally saw a specialist in trauma, and received some CBT, and what I found most helpful was EMDR.
Yes.
Which is a really useful form of light therapy, where I sort of have lights and to help me process some of the traumas that I'd faced. And it was through talking to her and sort of opening up about what I had that I actually was able to sort of identify how negative certain things had been. As I said, I was raised very religious, and I think partly, if you tell, because I was autistic, and I took a lot of it to heart. I took the whole sort of like the sort of original sin and the sort of condemnation to hell very literally, and believed that everything I did was basically wrong. So I blamed myself, and I had a lot of guilt as a result of that. So actually, I found a lot of help with my mental health came through sort of talking to the priest, the chaplain, when I was at university, and he helped me to understand sort of what my relationship with faith should be, and that I shouldn't feel sort of hated by God. So there was an awful lot of sort of things conflicting against each other, and I think that through having those discussions and through having therapy, I was able to sort of distinguish between different aspects of my mental health, which made each aspect more clear, so I could sort of talk about it, put labels on it, and deal with it. I should say that my dad is wonderfully open about mental health, and has always sort of, he does a lot of volunteering and sort of helping with young people's mental health, and he's always been so open and wonderful to talk to about these things. And then sort of, so I have had that in my home life as well, and he's always encouraged me to sort of seek out therapy, which has been massively helpful for me. It means that I can talk about it now, and as you said, I can write about aspects of that as well if I want to. I don't particularly like sort of being asked to do that. It has to come, I always feel like it has to come from me. If I've seen a film that I felt represented an aspect of mental health or my mental health, or I've identified with it and I really feel compelled to write about it, then I will. I've had some people sort of say, oh, would you write about trauma in relation to this film? And I think, well, I'd rather that come from my own experience and my own response, rather than being something that I don't want to be sort of put into a box of like
That's
always having to write about these same things, which is the benefit of being freelance, is that I can say no
yeah.
and choose what I do, because it's not my full-time job is I work on University Challenge
Yeah,
now.
I really want to talk about that, and I knew you were on it. I knew you're on that, and we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about Mastermind, and then I found out that you were working on it, and you're just kind of talking about. We'll talk about your dad, for instance, and it's so important to have a family member or a very close friend who allows you to be yourself, to open up about things, and also like the different kind of therapies and counseling that people can get, because maybe we talk about, it's not one size fits all kind of a thing, and it's very much CBT was so important for me, but it may not work for another, and I think that's so important as well, to be able to. We had a sound play therapist on, and I'd never heard of sound play therapy, but when he had finished speaking, I was like, I would definitely give it a go, like, because it looked like something I'd be into, and that's so important to acknowledge as well, so like, when did your love for films begin?
Well, that's a very good question. I think so. One of the things that I have a very clear memory, which has been both sort of a blessing and a curse. The curse in terms of how vivid my trauma has been, and that made processing it quite difficult.
Okay.
But as you said about sort of CBT and things, is that if you do them over an extended period of time, eventually they just become they change your mental processes to the point where I don't even need to consciously think about it anymore. I just sort of know, I can identify if I'm disassociating or if I've been triggered by something, and stop myself basically from going down those pathways, which is very, very helpful. But the blessing side of it is that I can remember pretty much every film I've ever seen, and can sort of play them back to myself in my head,
Nice.
which is nice. And I remember so clearly opening a VHS of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when I was a child. I think it was probably at Christmas. And I think that must have been the first film I saw. And I absolutely loved it. So that was the first film I think I saw. And then the first film I saw in the cinema was Monsters, Inc. When I was 2 years old, I think. And I remember my parents sort of they often remember me being in the cinema and sort of saying, oh, they must have an enormous videotape in order to play a film on a screen that size. I can remember I had in my head this image of this enormous VHS tape that was sort of inserted underneath the screen to play Monsters, Inc. So that's where it started. And then I think sort of in terms of cinephilia and how I got into film, I mean, my family, my brothers always loved films, and both of my parents love films too. And I think, but I didn't necessarily think of it as something that you could sort of pursue as a career or academically. I remember subscribing to Empire magazine when I was in my early teens, as I'm sure most people who get into films probably do, and suddenly being like, oh, I have to believe that all of these films are the greatest, and I need to watch every film on their greatest list of all time or whatever. And it's things like Hitchcock and Tarantino and filmmakers that sort of later in my life I've actually sort of done a U-turn on. It's like, actually, I don't like these films. Actually, I find a lot of them really triggering and really distressing on a mental health level. And I think it must have been when I was in sixth form or when I was getting started at university that I started reading Sight and Sound and Little White Lies and discovering that there were there were women who made films, and that, you know, that there wasn't this sort of list of 10 filmmakers that everyone should sort of know inside out if they want to be a cinephile. So I think it's changed over time, and then that's once I started accepting that you don't have to like everything that everyone else does. That's a good place to be in, I think.
That's a massive thing as well. You know, and it's not just for films that you can say that, but films is one of those things where everybody jumps on board. You know, one film or one, like you say, Tarantino is probably a great example of everybody jumping on board someone and just saying, you can't say he's done a bad film because you're just going to get jumped on by the internet, basically. So, you know, but when you started really getting into films, before you started writing for publications, did you do your own little reviews at home kind of a thing? Did you write about film for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I had, I used to have an Excel spreadsheet where I would record every film that I watched. And I was terrible for changing sort of my opinions on things. I'd sort of changed my ratings and stuff, and it got too big basically. And then I remember when I think I was in my my second year at university, I did an internship at Little White Lies, and I remember Hannah Strong, the associate editor there, she showed me this website called Letterboxd, which allows you effectively to log those films and to have them all in one place. And I love that. I kind of get a bit obsessed with like making sure I like having all of my films in sort of a list that I can say, these are the ones I've seen. It's a very useful tool that is better than trying to edit a spreadsheet.
Are you into sorry, Lillian, are you into the kind of star ratings when it comes to films?
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
I like lists. I like to have things sort of ordinarily ranked. So yeah, I definitely know exactly what each star rating means very specifically for me. So like a 5-star film for me is one which sort of affects me on a really deep emotional level. So I'm someone who struggles, and I've had sort of arguments with other writers and editors about this before, is I struggle to want to look at films objectively. I don't really understand what that means, because as far as I'm concerned, everyone responds to every film differently, and that there isn't sort of objective value to art, that something. I suppose where I've been told this before is that you have to sort of, as a critic, because you're sort of recommending or dissuading someone from seeing it, that you have to talk on a sort of level of craft rather than on a level of personal response. And I find that quite hard. To come back to your last question about writing reviews, I remember I used to write reviews in sort of the school paper, and then I did write my own reviews in my spare time. And then when I started at university, I started writing film reviews for Varsity, the Cambridge newspaper, and quickly applied to be the film and TV editor there. And I did that for well over 2 years, which no one is supposed to do. You're supposed to do it for like 1 term. But I just kept wanting to do it. And they were like, oh, okay, we'll let her do it. She because I would just spend all of my free time in the cinema. So I would just write about everything that I saw. And I built up quite a nice little bank of pieces, which I was then able to, that's how I then started getting paid to write film reviews, was by sort of saying, here's all my stuff, let me write for you, please. Which, if I look back at some of those reviews now, I think, goodness, I was such a pretentious so-and-so when I was writing, sort of experimenting with styles and different modes of criticism, because I love reading film reviews, and every publication has a sort of a different take. So like Sight and Sound won't have star ratings. It's a sort of I suppose that is in a sense to be as objective as possible, whereas there's a very you have to sort of change your style depending on which publication you're writing for, and I think I'm glad that I sort of got that out of the way while I was a student, rather than trying to figure out what my sort of critical voice is.
Yeah.
In a more public sphere.
Yeah, I understand that, and we've had that idea. Subjective and objective is, to me, I would be sway to your side with regards to that, because it is subjective. Every film has to be subjective. But with regards to mental health, then on screen, it's something that I've kind of been very interested in, and I've listed, like, I like lists like yourself. So I've listed a lot of films that try to portray mental health. Do you think that it's a difficult thing to capture on screen?
Yeah, definitely, because again, it's this mental health is in itself so subjective, and you can't universalize an experience of mental health. Certainly my mental health consists of so many different aspects, and I find it helpful to be able to sort of go, oh, that's my neurodivergence, or oh, that's my PTSD, or whatever. I find that useful to sort of delineate those things, and actually that often they sort of play into each other, and affect each other. So I don't think that no film should ever sell itself as being sort of the final word on a topic like sexual trauma or depression. And I think it is hard to portray without, because there are so many sort of stereotypes and archetypes. I think this is true of disability in general on screen, is that it's so easy to sort of fall prey to those tropes. And it's the films that rewrite those or try a different way of expressing them that I find most moving and most powerful. And often it's a film that I'll be really surprised to discover affected me that way. I'll watch a film thinking it's going to be one thing and it turns out to be another. The best example of which is David Lynch's Wild at Heart, which I wrote, which is one of those films which I sort of watched and immediately needed to start writing, because it had affected me on such a deep level that I wasn't expecting any film to be able to do, really. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a pretty stunning film.
Yeah, and it's specifically Laura Dern's character and the use of the visual metaphors of The Wizard of Oz as a means of showing how trauma can affect you, and that image of sort of the tapping the feet together and the no place like home, to sort of will yourself out of a situation and to will yourself out of sort of a flashback or a trauma, that I found a really beautiful and useful visual tool to sort of, in my own life and in my own trauma and dealing with things. Yeah, that's a good film. But again, it's not a film which sort of states itself to be a depiction of what female trauma is like. It's not. I don't want to. I mean, it's clearly part of the plot, and it's clearly what sort of the film's about. But it's not a film that sort of announces itself as trying to do that, which I think often is more powerful than films which sort of, like, if it was a film which said this is a film about X or Y.
I find that when they do that, when they make it about, we'll use depression as an example, and they make it about a depressive person, like you said about the stereotypes become a massive thing, and it becomes almost the character becomes almost cartoonish in for somebody who's maybe experienced depression. You're not looking at yourself or your own experiences. You're looking at this, hyper cartoonish version of it, and it just never comes across. And just when I was going down through the list I'd written out, a lot of the a lot of the films just didn't capture what they were trying to capture, and it's Wild at Heart was not on my list, but it's a great example and a beautiful use of something like the tapping of the feet. It's a really really clever little bit of writing. Let me Lillian, let me just read out an advert, and we'll get back to it if that's all right. Okay. Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone. A place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. That's that done for today. So, how do you feel with regards to female representation on screen? Is it getting better?
Oh goodness, yes. That's
Okay.
I think that's mainly because more women are making films and more women are being allowed to make films,
Yeah.
particularly mainstream films. It's interesting because when I talk about female representation and queer representation in my own research, it's in the post-war period, because what I find so fascinating is that we don't really talk about sort of the impact on women's mental health sort of following the Second World War, particularly of women who had lost husbands or children, and what cinema was offering people in that period. I think a lot's been written about sort of films made during the Second World War, and particularly in sort of in terms of a nationalist perspective. And I think British cinema is often, particularly of the 20th century, is always talked about its Britishness and its sort of national identity. Not very little has been sort of done in terms of representation of women. And how I'm so interested in how people would have felt watching a certain film. So if I'm watching a film from the late 40s or 50s made in this country, I think, how would a woman feel watching this film in that period? And it's very hard to find sort of the sources for that, because a lot of the immediate thing is to go and look at criticism. Well, most criticism it's very old criticism, and it's mostly written by men. And it's done from that very sort of objective style of criticism of sort of craft and style, rather than, and reviews used to be very short. They weren't sort of as complex and informed by personal experiences as they are now, which some people don't like because they like sort of being told if it's good or bad. Whereas I'm like, I don't like that at all. So I think that's why I did my undergraduate dissertation on Ealing Studios and representation of women, and I was so excited to go into the BFI archive and sort of find out how many women there were working at Ealing, who was writing the scripts, how they were changed, how they were sort of talked down often by people like Michael Balkan and some of the directors there into changing the way. There's a really great film called Dancehall, from 1950, which was written by Diane Morgan in the original script, and then it was changed by Sandy McKendrick and Charles Crichton, and it's such a different. It's so interesting seeing how films which are supposed to be sort of, right, we're going to do female representation now, and how they don't allow women to sort of do it on their own, if that makes sense. Another one I wrote about fairly recently for Girls on Tops was about Beauty and the Beast, and how Beauty and the Beast was sold and pitched as a feminist Disney film. And Linda Wolverton wrote the screenplay and wrote it as sort of portraying Belle as this very bookish, intelligent inventor character, and then she sort of had to let it go, and it was entirely taken over by Gary Drewsdale and Kirk Wise and all of the animators at Disney who were working on that film, and they changed it and they took little bits out just to make it a bit more acceptable to sort of standards of taste of how men in the industry want women to be portrayed. And I think that the biggest sort of disparity in Beauty and the Beast is the fact that Linda Wolverton writes the screenplay to portray her in one way, and the way that she's animated, the animators, their influence for Belle was she was going to be a combination of, it's something insane like Elizabeth Taylor, Natalie Wood, and Audrey Hepburn, and it's like, okay, no wonder this is like, when we talk about Disney princesses as being sort of like an unattainable standard of beauty, that's what it is. It's like 3 of the most gorgeous women who've ever lived combined into one. So it is, you know, so it's so interesting to see how even as late as something like Beauty and the Beast, which is in the early 90s, that's still happening. That there are sort of, every time a woman is allowed sort of creative influence, it's sort of how that's changed and how that's affected by the powers that be. And I think we're still seeing that now. You know, more women are directing Marvel films than ever. And I really enjoyed Eternals, the Chloe Zhao film, but I think it's quite obvious where like Kevin Feige has sort of said, no, you need to keep this element that we always have in our films, and there is there's a limitation to creativity and representation that are placed on those big sort of studio films, whereas it's really in art house and independent cinema that you really find that representation often, which is a shame because it doesn't reach as many people.
It's I just, because talking about independence and art house, and Celine Sciamma is one of the best filmmakers working today, and you got to interview her, and I know that you're a massive fan. How is it for you getting ready for an interview like that?
Well, once I'd sort of got over the thrill of being asked to interview her, I think you just want to make sure that when you've only got like half an hour to talk to someone, you really want to make sure that you're asking them things which no one else has asked them, or asking about things in a way that will be as interesting as possible, without making it alienating for someone who's not seen the film or isn't familiar with the work. I think that's a really hard balance to get, but you sort of read other interviews and make sure that you're not sort of repeating questions. And I asked her a question about an image in her new film, Petite Maman, of a sort of shadow of a black panther that appears in her childhood bedroom, and it terrifies the girl, who is sort of based on her own childhood experience. And she said that no one had asked her about that, and she was trying to think of what answer to give, and she said that perhaps it's a difficult question because there are some things that you don't want to sort of share. She described it as a secret of cinema, which I thought was really beautiful. So, you know, it's interesting how sort of filmmakers are able to work elements of their own mental health into films. And when you sort of sense that you've touched on something that they don't want to talk about, which is obviously fair enough, you don't then push them like some interviewers do. And actually, I think the way that she talked about that in a sort of abstract and general sense was really powerful. In fact, the part of that interview which I didn't include in my sort of transcription of it was I did sort of I did feel at one point that I did sort of have to tell her how much her films have meant to me, and how Portrait of Lady on Fire in particular had sort of resonated with me as a queer woman, and in terms of my sexuality. And she got quite choked at one point. It's hard to convey in writing sort of the emotion, and we were both sort of sobbing at one point. So it was quite, it can be quite powerful when you're talking about themes and representation. It can be quite overwhelming. I'm someone who does get overwhelmed a lot by by everything, but particularly sort of sensory overstimulation in society. And it does mean that sometimes I find certain situations quite difficult to deal with, which comes under neurodivergence. But I suppose the good thing about that is that I do find art really quite emotional and overwhelming. And one of the best examples of that is when I saw Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which was at the San Sebastian Film Festival. And I'd run for about 45 minutes to get to the screening because I didn't realize it was on the other side of the city.
Oh, okay.
I got the screen number wrong, and I was so worried I was going to miss it. And I arrived just in time. I was exhausted, and this film just completely overwhelmed me. And I just sort of collapsed afterwards because I was so emotionally drained by it. But I remember coming out of the cinema and I called a friend and I was saying like, I've just seen the greatest piece of art ever created. I was completely overwhelmed by it.
But I will say
she is special to me.
But I will say, like, I had a look on Wikipedia today, just to see, the films she's made. I've seen them all, and I knew I'd seen a lot, a few of her films, but I haven't seen Petite Maman yet. But I've seen the other feature films she's made, and she does represent, the female experience, obviously, on screen beautifully. And also, like, sexual identity is a massive thing for her as well. She's done it, like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, is just look, whatever about what happens in the film, right? Because we can talk about like that, we can talk about craft, whatever, but talk about portraits. The film itself is like a portrait. Every shot is as beautiful as the next. The costumes are beautiful. Everything about that film is beautiful. And it's one of those ones that just I can fully understand why it would be overwhelming, And of course, I would have loved to have seen it in cinema. I think I saw it on my iPad or something. Very, not the best place to see it. But look, I think it was a movie or something, so I had to kind of catch it on that. But she's an unbelievable filmmaker. When you talk about being overwhelmed by all different things, obviously, like we all are, do you think that today's anxieties, because I was going to say today's culture, but it seems to me that just, maybe I'm talking about my own problems, anxiety in general, but today's anxieties are being mirrored back on the screen?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that this is something that I've noticed more and more, is that my generation are very depressed generally and anxious about the way that the climate and the culture of our, particularly of this country, politically, and in terms of acceptance and sort of the closed-mindedness perhaps of older generations is depressing, because things should feel like they're moving forwards, but they feel like they're going backwards for a lot of people at the moment. And I think that's also true in terms of sort of mental health support. The waiting lists for things are off the charts, and the amount of times that I've been told when I've just been sort of seeking counselling or a diagnosis that, it would just be easier if you try to do it privately, and it's like, that's not that's not okay.
No, that isn't.
The amount of GPs that try to tell you to do that, it's unbelievable. I think we are increasingly seeing that as sort of more young filmmakers making films. I think that we are starting to see that sort of percolating through, and perhaps that produces more nuanced depictions of mental health. No, it's interesting. I think in terms of sort of climate change and sort of the state of the world and the depressive impact it can have, I was surprised that sort of Paul Schrader is perhaps one of the better filmmakers at depicting that. The film First Reformed really moved me on that level. And his latest film, The Card Counter, which I saw recently, has a similar sort of theme of someone who wishes that they can make a difference or try to enact at least a small change of good, and it's sort of the world sort of causes that to backfire. And I think that we live in a time which is quite sort of depressing, and I think a lot of my own depression isn't sort of things in my own life, it's things on a broader scale. When I see some of the sort of political sentiments that are expressed, and sort of certain columnists in The Guardian and so on, particularly in terms of the direction that feminism has turned in over the last couple of years, as a form of exclusion and not sort of identifying where the real enemy is, as such. I think it is depressing, and I think a lot of people almost don't know who's on their side anymore. And I've definitely talked to a lot of people of my own age who feel that that's the case. And cinema, I suppose, for a lot of us is a form of escape from that. So to some extent, we don't want to see those things represented, but at the same time, it's so important as a form of recognition, as much as anything else. I think that the value of cinema is often understated as a means through which we can learn to self-identify, and how much we learn from watching films and television and media more broadly, of suddenly realizing that something, that the feelings that it causes you to feel are something deeper than just sort of that contained within the art itself. And I think that's definitely true of mental health. If you see a film which sort of depicts, I mean, I talk about trauma a lot because it's my personal experience, that if you see that, it can help you to sort of verbalize that. I remember when Inside Out came out in is it 2016, 2015, 2016?
Around that.
There was a lot of talk about how that film had sort of helped children to talk about emotions and emotional health. And I think that Inside Out's an incredibly powerful film. And that's sort of, we often, or I say we, in terms of critics and sort of the industry in general, is sort of quite dismissive of animation a lot of the time. But I think that almost like a film like that, which you can show a child, and sort of if it gives someone a tool to talk about something, and very clearly distinguished and identifiable emotions, which certainly for neurodivergent people and neurodivergent children can be very helpful. I think that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when you have your you podcast and your blog and things like that, and you do talk about the female experience on screen, but also to do with the queer experience on screen. You know, do you think it's helping to change attitudes? And I'm asking this question kind of on the side of, over the years, you know, they've used maybe gay characters, or anybody who's slightly different, and you could say mental health, someone who's experienced mental health, as a kind of a piñata. You know, they seem to be the ones that it's okay to call a derogatory name because this is who they are. It's changing, but do you think it can help all of us change in the way we look at people in general, I suppose?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that's why I'm so, I mean, I think that there are very much sort of missteps that still exist, but on the whole, I think that for queer people, cinema is sort of improving in its representation. Because the importance, it's so important for queer representation to not just be about the fact that someone is queer or a process of coming out. It's like just showing queerness as something that exists within the world and allowing that simply to exist. And I think that some of the best filmmakers doing that on a mainstream scale are the Wachowskis, and I think that even right from the beginning of their career with Bound and right up to Sense8, which I think is one of the greatest TV series ever made in terms of its representation, particularly of queerness and of trans identity. I think that they're so brilliant at showing people sort of existing within the world and how that reflects the real lived experience of queerness more than other films do, which is why it's so interesting reading queerness into films which aren't sort of explicit about it, or tracing the history of queerness in cinema right from the outset and the very beginning, because it's always been there, of course. And I think in Britain in a lot of ways, particularly in terms of gay representation, has perhaps been one of the more pioneering or boundary pushing, particularly in the 50s and certainly in the 60s. And this is what I really enjoyed looking at when I was looking at Ealing Studios, is something like a filmmaker like Robert Hamer, who made Kind Hearts and Coronets. And Kind Hearts and Coronets is a film made by and starring gay men, and it's extraordinary to see how that's sort of represented. And Dearden, Basil Dearden made Victim in 1961, which is famous mostly for being sort of the first film to use the word homosexual. And it's so fascinating looking at films sort of made by queer filmmakers in the early 60s, before the legalization of homosexuality in 67. It's so fascinating to see how sort of you could push the censors and get around that, and how you represent queerness without offending, and how people would have felt seeing those films. I mean, obviously we can't know how people would have felt because you're not there, but it's also even more important perhaps to see how those films can resonate with people today. That's what I do with my podcast anyway. And I hope to do some more of it. I've been talking to some people about potentially doing some more episodes of it, because I haven't done one for a little while. But it's great to just pick a film which isn't necessarily explicitly about representation, but how people feel sort of represented, or and that can be from something like a Derek Jarman film or Spice World. I had one of my best podcasts, best chats with my friend Lintha about Spice World and female and queer representation in from the Spice Girls, and how they sort of capture a certain cultural moment.
They did, and they were pioneers in what they were doing at the time as well, and I just want to point out before we move on to the Mastermind section, you did a brilliant video essay on horror and ballet, which I watched yesterday, and people need to check it out. It's over on Little White Lies YouTube page, but it was one of those things where obviously you think of Black Swan, and you can see this kind of terrifying thing that's happening to the lead character. But I watched The Red Shoes years ago. It was around Christmas, sometimes on TV in the afternoon, and I really liked it, And I watched it the second time, and I saw something that often happens with films, that you see stuff that you hadn't seen before. And then I watched your video essay, and now I have to watch it again, because it's another perspective of the same film, and you're kind of, I didn't see that as that, so I'm definitely going to go back and watch The Red Shoes, and it's a brilliant film anyway, and it's worth watching again and again.
Thank you.
I kind of went off on one there, Lillian. I apologize, but
no, it's and actually, I mean, that's another thing that I've written a lot about and looked at. My master's thesis was on Palin Pressburger and ballet. Which is where that video essay it was sort of an aspect of what I was looking at. And I think that I'm glad you mentioned The Red Shoes, because it is a fascinating film about mental health, and how the Archers coded sort of when we were going inside Vicky Page's mindset and when we were outside of it, and how her mental health deteriorates during that film. Whether that's a healthy or positive depiction is something that I've sort of debated with myself about, because, you know, the way it ends is incredibly tragic, and you wish that, you know, that she sort of, that her death is sort of the only way out of sort of this dilemma that she's facing of choosing between sort of art and life, and that there is no answer to that a woman can't have both. And of course that's absurd. But it is interesting to see how that, particularly in the period that it's set in and the period it was made in, I always think it's incredible that Powell and Pressburger's films were made, like a film like that was made in 1948, because other films from 1948 don't look like The Red Shoes. No,
but their themes, their themes in general, I should say, seem to be ahead of their time anyway with a lot of their films.
Massively so.
Yeah, and I like, you can only respect, and we can talk about modern day filmmakers as well, because they do the same thing in different ways, but it's the kind of idea of pushing the envelope to see what they can create. And look, like you mentioned censors earlier on, like there's an idea of those censors being a lot tighter around then. So for them to push those films through that they did, I mean, you can only say, well done. You know, but listen, I've like, we have to talk about Mastermind, because I love Mastermind. I think it's just it's brilliant. And anytime someone asks me what my specialist subject would be, and this is me being, listen, I shouldn't have a specialist subject, but it would be the Beatles, because I am a massive Beatles fan. So that would be mine. Now, you were on, first of all, how was the experience of being there and being in that chair? Because everybody just sees that chair as the most daunting thing.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I found the whole experience terrifying, and thankfully my partner at the time was able to come with me, and that was very useful, and they facilitated that when I was sort of asked about measures that they could put in place to help me to make it a more accessible experience. It wasn't as terrifying as I think it would have been if there'd been an audience, because we shot it during COVID. But before I sat in that chair, I had absolutely believed that I knew everything that there was to know about Sylvia Plath, or at the very least, everything that was worth knowing about Sylvia Plath.
Fair, yeah.
And it was so strange watching that episode back, because the panic on my face, and I could see myself sort of starting to hyperventilate, and I looked like I was going to throw up. It was quite hard to watch that. And the reason why was because the first two questions were so ridiculously hard, and that I suddenly panicked and thought, I'm going to get 0 on this.
Okay.
And I was really distressed, because and also for me, choosing Sylvia Plath as a subject was sort of, there was an element of catharsis to that, and I wanted to do justice to my research in her, because I don't just love films, I love all sort of aspects of culture, and I've done a lot of research into Plath. I wrote an article for BBC Culture about the way that her mental health, and particularly her death, has sort of been portrayed. There's this quote that is absolutely horrifying, which says that sort of the greatest career move that Plath ever made was killing herself, in terms of her legacy. And so many books and articles and sort of critical studies of Plath focus so much on her death and on her mental state, and how that can be read into everything she did throughout her life. And I find that an incredibly reductive and quite dangerous way of looking at an artist, and that you cannot retrospectively analyze someone's art in that way. There's a sort of predetermination to it that I find very uncomfortable. So when I was choosing my subject, I mean, my immediate instinct was to do sort of something film related, but I really wanted to do Sylvia Plath, and I think I might have pissed off the question writers, because they sent me a reading list, and the reading list was quite out of date, so I sort of made some suggestions on what books they should be using to write the questions, and I have a feeling that sort of out of spite they threw me a few impossible ones, like knowing which publication individual poems were published in. And I think also one of the hardest things about doing it is that you have to be prepared to let a question go immediately. And a lot of the time I had sort of the right answer in my head and another answer, and I knew that this was going to be a problem with character names in the bell jar, because character names because the people in the bell jar are obviously sort of versions of real people, and it's remembering which one's which. And I made that mistake. I said Olive Higgins Prouty rather than Philomena Guinea.
Was that the one where you did the eye?
No, that was
the eye roll was brilliant.
Thank you. That was Heptonstall. And I said Hapleston, which is all of the right syllables in the wrong order. Which I was annoyed about with myself for. But you know, it's such a strange experience, and your brain works in a very different way in that situation. You know, I think honestly, the fact that I managed to actually sort of answer anything, I'm quite proud of myself for.
There you go.
Because I think I have sort of, I don't know if it's masochistic or what it is, but I have a sort of instinct, because I have a lot of anxiety and struggle with my self-confidence and my self-image a lot, to sort of push myself into situations that I find deeply uncomfortable in a sort of sink or swim attitude. And then, because I often find that once I've done something once, I can do it again, or it becomes easier the next time. So I'd love to do Mastermind again, and I'm sure it would go much better than this occasion. I'd choose a smaller topic. Sylvia Plath is, I mean, I thought it was quite, as I say, it was something that I'd sort of known a lot about for a long time, and it is actually, when it came down to sort of revising it in a quiz style, it's actually quite a massive topic to just choose someone's. Like, I mean, you said the Beatles. You really would want to.
I'd have to narrow
that down.
1968. That's it.
Yeah, just do the Beatles in '68.
But let me ask.
Good, actually.
That would be good. Yeah. But let me ask you, Lillian, because you said about, you know, if you have anxieties, and I have the same issues with anxiety. Would suggest to myself that I shouldn't go on these things, and there's obviously something in you that whether it's just this is what you wanted to do to challenge yourself, or it's you wanted to challenge the anxiety by doing something like this. It's a hell of a thing to take on, because like you said, 6 times on University Challenge, you were on Mastermind. I mean, that's putting a lot of pressure on yourself and on your anxieties.
Yeah, I think that's how I've always dealt with them. For as long as I can remember, I've always pushed myself perhaps too far at times. I've always been very critical of myself, and always think I'm not achieving or doing enough. And sometimes you just have to give yourself a break, and I find that quite hard. I don't know what aspect of my mental health that comes under, but it is definitely a sort of inferiority complex, I suppose, on some level. Being at Cambridge did not help with that. To be clear, I mean, that's a whole different aspect of sort of academic pressures and difficulties. But I don't know. I think that I never want to regret not having done something. And I know that I struggle with a lot of things, and there's a great amount of satisfaction, I think, that I take in overcoming those difficulties.
And what do you do on University Challenge now? Because you obviously work over there.
Yeah, so definitely doing University Challenge made me realize that I'd much rather be someone sort of judging other people for not knowing the answers to the questions than having to get them right myself. And I met the lovely production team when I was doing it. I thought, God, this is just such a great job. I'd love to do this and work with the students and do the casting and write the questions, which is what I've been doing. I do the picture and music questions is the main thing that I sort of work on, and my main remit in terms of sort of, I wrote a piece actually earlier this year about the canon, the film canon, and how it's sort of been curated by a very specific group of people and with a very specific mindset for what quality of cinema is, and how that often excludes minority representation. And I've always been interested in that in terms of the canon of knowledge more broadly, and how certain things influence what is deemed something worthy of note or something that's worth knowing about. So I think that for me, writing questions and putting those things into a set of pictures, say for example, it's films that have particularly strong lesbian representation, or if it's paintings by women that people should probably be more aware of, then there are ways of working these things in and introducing them, and then the sort of people who will revise before going on University Challenge will go, they're asking about that, I need to take note of that. And my attitude to quizzing has always been a bit different to a lot of people. I think a lot of people quiz as a means of showing off what they know, which has never been what I want to get out of it. I always want to learn something and learn about things that I'm not aware of, which is perhaps why I'm better at writing quizzes than playing them, because I get to do that, and I get to take the time to research things and find things that fascinate me and that resonate with me, and find ways to ask about them in ways that are knowable or acceptable within that format. I think that there's an open-mindedness that comes with quizzing in that respect, that I love, and I love that my job is basically allows me to investigate things that I'm interested in, and I mean
that's so great
and so on.
Yeah, I mean, but it's so great for someone with your mindset who does enjoy doing those things to kind of finding things that interest you or fascinate you and turning them into questions for other people to learn from. I think I love University Challenge. I get about 4 right in an episode. I love when he says, when it's, what's the phrasing? I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but you're going to hear 3 pieces of. Now, if he says popular music, I'm in. If he says classical music, I'm guessing. I'm just throwing whatever names are, and films is another thing. As soon as he says films, I'm like, maybe I'll get something right here. But I love watching it because, like you said, I do learn stuff from it. And that's the most important thing from watching, a program like University Challenge. So I'm going to ask you a couple of very kind of broad, well, not so much broad, but film questions just before we finish up. But there's another question we always ask. Outside of film, Lillian, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Oh, is there anything but films?
That's a good question.
Well, as I sort of touched on, I mean, reading and writing is sort of my main way of relaxing.
What are you reading at the moment?
What am I reading at the moment? That's a very good question. I'm sort of in between. Books, as we always are.
Well, it's like if you start 2 at the same time. I like to have one, like a fiction and a non-fiction on the go, and then it's I get kind of forgetful of what I'm on. I am reading Jonathan Franzen's new book. It's a book.
I'm terrible for buying too many books and then not actually reading them.
Yeah.
But Fitzcarraldo had a Black Friday sale, so I've got a few of those. So
Oh, nice.
I think I might start on the new Olga Tokarczuk, although that is a big book.
Okay.
And I'm in terms of nonfiction, I'm reading Explaining Humans by Camilla Pang.
Oh, nice.
Which is wonderful. It's sort of a scientific look at autism and how sort of autistic people understand other people, which I'm enjoying.
Wow. Do you know what's fascinating about and obviously you do your own podcast, but what's fascinating to me about doing a podcast is I'll get drawn in talking to someone. I had a marine biologist on recently, for example, and not knowing a lot about marine biology, I kind of want to find out more since we have the chat. And talking to you, I want to like dig deeper into what we've talked about, like queerness on screen, or female representation, and that's what I love. And I'll go and get books from this podcast now, and that's what I hold very dear to me, because I do love reading, and I love learning about new things that I didn't maybe know enough about. I suppose I have to ask you. Okay, I'll frame it this way. If you only had one film to watch for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Les Demoiselles de Rochefort is my favorite film.
Could you just give us a little bit of a background on what that film is?
So it's a French musical by Jacques Demy, who is perhaps more famous for Les Parapluies de Cherbourg, Umbrellas of Cherbourg.
Yeah.
And it's the musical he makes after that with it's got Gene Kelly in it, singing in French. So what more could you want?
What's the translation of that, Lily? That film?
Sorry, it's the English title is The Young Girls of Rochefort. That's what it's.
Oh, I've heard of it. Sorry.
It's a joyous, beautiful, colourful musical, which also has sort of this deep melancholy to it. And I love musicals, and I love Demy, and I love the Nouvelle Vague, and it just combines everything that I love in films. No, it's people always say that it must be hard to choose a favorite film. But as I said before, I'm someone who likes to list things and have things in order, and I could tell you sort of my 100 favorite films in order if necessary. Lillian, so it's never a difficult question.
Let me just put this across, because I've made this point. It was about 20 episodes ago. We did a quiz, and we had four men in one episode, 4 women on the other episode, and we're going to do some sort of final. But when I was posing the questions, they were all, well, how can you name it? And I said exactly the same as you. I could list you, no problem. My favorite film is 12 Angry Men, and I can go from there, right? But to me, it's simple. To you, it's simple. We like lists and doing stuff like that. And I understand that. But they could not understand how I can just have my favorite songs, my favorite films, all these favorite things just listed out in my head. But I do. And that's me. And that's obviously you as well.
Likewise. Exactly.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to know somebody does the same thing. So let's talk your film of the year.
So my film of the year is Souvenir Part 2, which I was delighted to see is also the Sight and Sound film of the year, which makes me very happy. That doesn't often happen, where sort of these end of the year lists align with your own so closely. I mean, it's partly because I voted in it, but but yeah, that's a gorgeous film, and actually, that's a film which and the first Souvenir film is a fascinating film about mental health and putting mental health into art, and how we about sort of how to veil real experience and autobiography into a film, both on the part of Joanna Hogg, and then within the film, Joanna Hogg making the film with Honest Winton Byrne as Julie, and there's so many layers to it and the second film is really about sort of the trauma of having had a partner who had mental health issues and took his own life, and then how she sort of processes that, how she works it through in her filmmaking, and ultimately sort of learns to put herself and her own mental health first, rather than sort of feeling like you can't move on, or it's a gorgeous film.
I cannot wait to see it. I've seen the first one, obviously, when it came out, and it's an incredible, it's a really moving film. My favorites, like, I have to say that the cinema here in Athlone is terrible. It's only blockbusters, so I don't get to go to cinema that often, and I can only see maybe what's streaming and stuff. I don't do the illegal thing anymore. It's too risky. I mean, anymore. I never did it. But anyway,
Of course not.
My film, like, I have to give an honorable mention to Get Back, the Beatles Get Back, just because I'm such a big Beatles fan. But
I need to see it. I haven't got around to it yet. I mean, I think the runtime sort of scares me a bit, but I will watch it.
I think for someone who is creative and would be interested in to see the process of creativity, even if you're not a huge Beatles fan, I think it's interesting. But I would say my favorite film so far of the year is The Power of the Dog. I watched it now this is coming out a bit later now, but I watched it on a couple of days ago. Jane Campion, brilliant to have her back. Amazing filmmaker. The direction is unbelievable. Everything about the film is great, but I would have never had Benedict Cumberbatch really high up when it comes to acting. I think he's a good actor, but I never had him up there, but in that film, he's just so menacing, and there's so many layers to him, and there's so many layers to the story, and I'm not going to say anything about the story because it's really one you should see before before, but it's just did you see the film?
It's interesting. I have a bad relationship with Jane Campion.
Oh, really?
There's something about her films which really, really rile against me, and unfortunately, The Power of the Dog is no different. There's a certain racism and misogyny to her films that I find really uncomfortable, and I don't know because no one else. Well, I say no one else. Some people do see that. There's been some brilliant pieces written on the piano over the years which really unpack the film's sort of inherent racism,
really,
and its depiction of Indigenous people, which is horrifying as far as I'm concerned. And again, the piano is I think a really sort of egregious depiction of trauma. One of the worst examples of
really?
Depiction of mental health, I would say. I don't know. There's something about her sensibility and her filmmaking that doesn't affect me in a positive way. Which is a shame, because I wish I could, because everyone else loves her films, but I can't. I need to, basically what I'm trying to say is I need to really sort of give some time to put together a cohesive and coherent argument about what it is about Jane Campion that I don't like. But that's what I mean when I talk about the subjectivity of cinema. It's absolutely like these things affect us in different ways, and my God, I wish we had some content warnings on things. I was at the London Film Festival and I saw Spencer. I knew nothing about it beforehand, and I did have someone that was sort of saying to me, "Oh, well, you should have been aware that it was going to depict X, Y, and Z in this way." And I was like, "Why should I? No one should ever." You should never have to read up on a film before you see it. And I didn't even know I was going to be seeing it that morning, because it's a film festival and you sort of go in blind. At least that's how I like to do film festivals. And its portrayal of mental health issues and eating disorders and self-harm, I found so egregious and just insensitive that I found myself really triggered by it. And triggers are different for everyone, and sometimes we can't always identify what our triggers are and what's going to trigger us. Sometimes it could be something really unexpected, which is often what I find watching Jane Campion's films, actually, and I think I found watching Power of the Dog as well, that there were just aspects of it that really played with my mind. So it does make it hard for me to sort of look at films like that objectively, if such a thing is possible.
No, I think with obviously we can't, I don't want to say that theme of The Power of the Dog, because, I don't want to spoil it for anybody. And I think it's to open it up would be great to have that kind of conversation with you, but I don't want to do it just in case there's people tuning in, they haven't seen it yet, and it's like, I don't want to be spoiler alert and all that. But I understand where you're coming from with regards to trigger warnings. I think it would be a really good idea to do it. And unfortunately, there's going to be people out there going against it, because that's the way things work. There's people for and against it. I would agree totally with your point of view. And there was a big thing about the Beatles Get Back, that it said it gave a warning that there was going to be smoking on screen, and I saw people giving out about that. Like, why are you giving out about smoking? The idea that they're going to warn people that they're smoking on screen, considering what happened to George Harrison. He passed away from throat cancer. It makes sense to me why they would do it.
Yeah.
But yourself.
I mean, that's because it's on Disney Plus, and Disney puts warnings like that on most things, which I think is great. Streaming services absolutely have no excuse for it. Netflix is very good with content warnings. I think when the 4th series of The Crown, every episode that depicted Diana's eating disorder had a really clear content warning at the start of the episode. I don't understand why that same principle can't apply to cinemas and particularly to festival screenings, because when you go to the cinema, you get like the BBFC card, and it's a very broad sort of like reductive thing that at least it says like this film contains sexual violence. You know it's going to be there, but you see a film at a festival, there's a very brief synopsis in the program. There will be very little beforehand that really sort of tells you what the content of the film is going to be. And there are people who would argue that to put a content warning at the start of the film would be to sort of spoil it in some way. But the real way to spoil a film is to trigger someone who wouldn't be aware of that, and it's a case of privilege and of access as well. It's always sort of privileged people who make that argument, and unfortunately, I don't know if they're the dominant voice, but they're certainly a vocal one, and I think that's why it doesn't change.
They're the loudest, I would say. But
I think that's true. And I think to come to sort of my earlier point about sort of the state of things, it can be very hard sometimes to distinguish between what's a majority opinion or what's a majority view and what's just being shouted really loudly. That can be difficult to delineate sometimes.
Well, listen, thank you very much for the thing, pointing out the Jane Campion thing, because I would like to watch The Piano again now and see it from a different point of view.
That might just be my
of course
interpretation of that film, and I'm more than willing. I love talking about Jane Campion's films because I'm always fascinated to hear what people see in them that I don't.
And vice versa for me. That's the brilliant thing about films. Again, going back to subjectivity and in reviewing them. Lillian, where can people find you?
What, in person?
It's just like, no, not in person. Don't give that information. Twitter, your podcast, your blog and your podcast and things like that.
Sorry. So I have a website. It's lilcrawford.co.uk and it's also linked on my Twitter. All of my Twitter and Instagram handles is LILLCRAWF, which has links to everything that I write on. But I'm in sort of Little White Lies quite regularly and at various other places.
Absolutely. Check, and again, once I said, check out that video essay. It's great. Lillian, you've been a wonderful guest, and it was a pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you. Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
That's okay. Could you wait for just 2 minutes? I'll close it out, take a quick photograph, and we'll go on our way.
Of course.
Thank you very much. Okay, I want to also thank John Francis, as always, for his technical knowledge and helping me set up any of this stuff that I'm incapable of. Thanks to the people who got me, where I am, I suppose. My mum, my dad, my granddad, Jaron Calvin, as always. Subscribe to YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts, etc. I think that's everything covered. Thanks for the support. Thanks everyone for watching. And once again, Lillian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And everybody else, take care and have a lovely week. See you next week. Bye.